Hello, welcome to the Motorsport Review. I am your host, Perry Brown, and here to talk about the Japanese Grand Prix. And as I'm sure we're going to get into, maybe not the most entertaining race, but certainly an interesting one with lots of subplots and topics that will take us through the 2025 season and will probably tell a big story come the result of the championship at the end of it. And joining myself tonight, I am absolutely delighted to introduce Tom Cairns. How are you, Tom?
Hello, Perry. Hello to everyone. Yes, so 3 rounds in, 21 to go, and 3 different race winners, something which Formula 1 has not had for 12 years, believe it or not. Yes, the race may not have been that interesting on Sunday, although some may disagree with that, but we didn't see enough of it. But at least the result of it has thrown the championship wide open.
It certainly has. As I say, it's going to play a big part in it later on, I think. And there's really only one question that we need to really delve into today. Tom, could or should McLaren have won this race this weekend?
I definitely think they should have taken pole. Whether they should have won the race or not, I'm a little bit surprised they didn't take more of a gamble with the pit strategy when they pitted Norris at the same time as Verstappen. Now, would the undercut have worked at Suzuka? I don't really think it was that effective at Suzuka like what we saw in Shanghai 2 weeks before. I don't think it's one of those that they should have won, but maybe it's more the fact they should have tried a little bit more with the strategy to at least make it more challenging for Red Bull. That'd be what I would sum it as.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I'm sure we'll break into that and crack it down later on in the podcast. But you started straight away with qualifying. I think this is where we have to. I know Max Verstappen has his critics. A lot of people maybe don't like the way he goes racing. Sometimes you do just have to stand up and applaud and go, that was an incredible performance. And of course, everyone was watching qualifying. We saw Piastri had set his opening lap. Norris goes and beats it, and we're almost congratulating Norris on taking pole position, when suddenly the camera cuts to Verstappen. He comes out the final corner, and by 0.012 seconds he pips them to pole, and as we now know, perhaps the race. And he gained something like 2/10 in that final chicane. Piastri made a mistake as well. So yeah, what did you make of that qualifying lap?
It was phenomenal from Max. It certainly was one of the best I think he produced, given that the car, I think on paper, is like the 4th fastest, but we know that Max can extract more than what that car is capable of doing, and Suzuka demonstrated it. Is that a sign of things to come in the coming races for Bahrain and Saudi Arabia? I'm not 100% sure. I think those two circuits will be different to what we saw in Suzuka, because what we've got to remember is that Suzuka was a race where air and track temperatures were rather low. It was a very cold event over in Japan, whereas Bahrain and Saudi, I think, will be a lot hotter compared to what we had seen in Suzuka. Now, in the Middle East, we know Red Bull are rather stronger over there compared to what we've seen in, I think, in Australia, China, and Japan. So it could play into their hands, and Max, I think, will take the fight to Lando and Oscar a little bit more. I'm just worried as well as to whether Ferrari and Mercedes will actually pick it up a little bit, because it felt to me like they were in a league of their own behind them, behind those 3 cars. And I want to see more of that I want to see more from Ferrari and Merc if they're going to be fighting for the championship in the near future.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll get onto it later on as well. Hopefully the second Red Bull as well will feature in that, and we could potentially see later on 8 drivers all gunning for race victories. That's what I think every F1 fan would like, because I think I've made it clear on the podcast before, I'm a McLaren fan. I love to see McLaren win. I love to see a McLaren 1-2. But what I love to see more than that is a race that McLaren win. So you're only as good as the opponent that you beat on the day. And if you can say we beat 6 other drivers that were absolutely gunning for it and giving their best, then I mean, you have to take your hat off to your own team and say we've done the best job. So absolutely, I want to see more from Ferrari, more from Mercedes, which we'll get into later on, because I feel like Leclerc kind of bottled up Russell a little bit, and we didn't possibly see the true pace of the Mercedes. So yeah, absolutely incredible lap from Verstappen. He's sitting on pole position and gets away well. I think it was a pretty mundane start. What I was more surprised, Suzuka turn one normally throws up at least one car going through the gravel, but 20 cars all got through there very cleanly, very precisely, and it was a clean race start. What did you make of the start itself?
It feels like every year the driving standards have been improving more and more and more with the talent that we've got on the grid. That's the way I look at it. I know some people may not rate some drivers as much as others, but that's part of racing. But that underlines the level of talent that we've got on the grid compared to, let's say, 20, 25 years ago, because we would have seen more racing incidents. In fact, I go back to 2018, Perry, where there were a lot of first lap incidents during the races of that year, whereas this year, we've had one with Doohan crashing out, and obviously Hadjar crashing on the formation that, and of course Sainz losing it on the safety car. But it feels like the standards of first lap action have been improving quite a bit, and I think we're going to see more of that in Bahrain, certainly, I think, and maybe in Saudi. But you know, the drivers have behaved themselves this time. I think Suzuka was a good opportunity for some of these drivers to sort of learn the ropes about how their cars worked, because I think in Shanghai we only had one practice session and they didn't have enough time really to understand how the car works in normal temperatures, whereas in Suzuka they had more practice time. I know there was like the stoppages with the grass being on fire, which was one of the topics of the weekend, which was a little bit surprising, but yeah, I was happy with how the drivers behaved throughout the race, has to be said. No one picking up any penalty points. I don't think there was even a time penalty given to anyone. So at least everyone came away with a clean race weekend, apart from maybe Jack Doohan, who crashed his Alpine and FP2, which was frightening, but at least he came away from that unscathed.
Absolutely, yeah, that was a scary one. We'll talk about and his race a little bit later on, but yeah, especially with 6 rookies, and we say the term, I think, loosely now, rookies, because some of them have driven Grand Prix before this season had begun anyway, but also the amount of time that they have and how much preparation they do before they get to F1. I think it really shows now that when anyone arrives in Formula One on that scene, they are ready. They are able to go wheel to wheel. And as you say, it's so clean, but it's not just the lack of people going off even through the gravel runoff, but these front wings are so wide. It's so easy to knock like a bit of the front wing so easily. And again, we haven't seen that here. They've all got through cleanly, and yeah, there was a couple of investigations, I think, just to give the stewards something to do, because they weren't getting much entertainment watching the racing perhaps. But yeah, a couple of investigations, and they let them through. It was just people running wide through the final chicane. I think Sainz went off there about 3 times, and maybe Alonso as well, but they went no investigation necessary, and that was that. So that takes us perhaps to the other investigation that they had, the biggest talking point of the race, bar none, which was when McLaren and Verstappen decided they were going to pit at the same time. And it's, as I say, the big talking point. Stewart said no investigation necessary. I didn't hear much complaining either way. You know, McLaren saying, "Oh, we should have been investigated more." Red Bull saying it should have been more of it as well. So did you agree with that decision as well? What did you make of that pit exit?
Yeah, I agreed with the decision, because I don't think Verstappen did anything wrong. I mean, he had his nose in front by a long way. He obviously had to leave room for Norris, but Norris was never going to get through a pit exit, so he should have just, played the safe game and just tucked in behind and go at it on circuit together. So that'll be one for McLaren to just let that one go, and just praise Red Bull on the day that they played it better than they did. But of course, another topic which may go on to a little bit is the Norris Piastri situation, where should Norris have allowed Piastri go? In my honest opinion, I think McLaren should have just let them race as they were doing. I think Norris warranted the second place more than Piastri did. But it was just the fact that they were all so close together all the way through. And I think that was part of the reason why McLaren were thinking, if we let Oscar go and then we have a punt of Max and then he doesn't go past him, do they let Norris go back through again? Something which Mercedes have done before in Hungary many years back. In my honest opinion, I don't think it would have made any difference.
No, I agree. Piastri getting as close as he did to Norris kind of gives you an inkling that maybe he could run closer. We don't know the exact setup levels on those cars, whether he had a bit more front end that allowed him to stay close to, or whether it was just Norris trying to hold back so he had something for later on. So yeah, I don't think Piastri would have gone through. It would have been nice to see McLaren try something. I think that's what the overriding sense was, certainly looking online. However, Hungary 2024, I think it still looms over them. If they've got to come over the radio and say, look, Piastri, Norris let you through, you've got to let him back through, we know how it goes online. And I think they were a bit worried about that. And we kind of skipped over the pit stops a little bit, but I kind of feel like that played into that as well, that they did the dummy on lap 18 with Norris. Oh, we're going to pit you. No, stay out. Piastri then came in to cover off George Russell, who pitted behind. And I felt like, again, this was the moment Verstappen pits. Norris's obvious choice, you would have thought at this point, is, well, do the opposite. You very rarely do the same as the driver in front. And again, the big question, we'll never know, would he have taken the lead had he stayed out? But yeah, do you feel the same way, that this was covering themselves off, that they'll always pit the other lap to the other driver, if that makes sense?
I would have maybe gambled a little bit to see if Norris can extend the stint on the mediums before he came in for the hards, and that way it would have made Red Bull work for it a little bit more. But then the worry is being undercut by the likes of Piastri, Leclerc, and Russell. I think that's what McLaren would have been worried about. Had they built up such a margin, it would have been worth taking the gamble. But I think they've just got to think of the long game, for later in the year. If Norris lost places in that race in Suzuka, it could have come back to haunt him later in the year, because the gap at the top now is just 1 point between Norris and Verstappen. So if Norris tried something different and it didn't pay off, Verstappen would have been in the lead of the championship. So I think McLaren have just got to play the consistency game. They know they're not going to win every single race, and yesterday showed it. But I think, they know they've got the car to beat over everyone else, and I would expect them to be in the mix, certainly for a race win in both Bahrain and Saudi.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really good point, again, that we often criticize teams, and McLaren have come under fire for this before, if they try to do something different and it doesn't work, and you go, well, there was an obvious choice there and you took something different and it cost you. So it's easy for a decision to cost more than just doing the same as everyone else. So yeah, it was what it was. And as I think we've got to, that the qualifying was really where the race was lost for McLaren this weekend. But I was just about to say plenty of other racing, but we didn't really see too much of it. But I did touch earlier on Leclerc and Russell. Now, as you say, when Russell pitted and Leclerc pitted at the same time as well, they were very close to the back of Piastri. They did have to cover that threat off. Ultimately, they finished something like 13 seconds behind, I think. They weren't really there. And this was at a slower pace, perhaps at the top three, than the McLarens could have possibly done if they were on their own. In fact, we'll get onto the comment of Verstappen as well, where he said if he had been in a McLaren, you wouldn't have seen him, which I think is a little bit unfair. But did we really see Russell's true pace, or was, again, he bottlenecked by Leclerc?
It's difficult to say. I mean, I'm looking at the gap between Leclerc and Russell. I mean, it was over a second, wasn't it? And Antonelli's closing in behind. I don't honestly think Mercedes had the pace to get a podium in, quite frankly. So even if they finished ahead of Leclerc, I think they'd be coming away from Japan thinking that they would have had a lot of work to do anyway. They're in a good position in the Constructors' Championship. Certainly far better compared to what they were this time last year. Because at the beginning of last year, Mercedes really, really were on the back foot compared to their counterparts. I would say I wouldn't be too downhearted with where Mercedes were in terms of what their true pace was. If Russell was in clean air, would he have closed in on Piastri? Probably, but even if he did close in on the top three, he wouldn't have passed them. So I don't think there was any point in taking life out of the power unit more than what Mercedes needed to do, because Suzuka proved at the weekend that overtaking was rather difficult, especially when you're, in cooler conditions. The tyres aren't falling away as quickly as what there have been in the past when it's like a lot hotter conditions over at Suzuka. In Shanghai, the tyres did fall away in the hotter conditions, but not quite so in the cooler conditions. And Suzuka was another example of it. But I expect that to change in the coming races in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, the other thing was that they had completely resurfaced Sector 1, and that is known as a bit of a tyre killer. Well, when they've resurfaced it and they give them a little bit more grip in the tyres, they can take it that little bit quicker without taking the life out of the tyres. I think that was a key factor in the tyre degradation wasn't really seen here compared to previous years. So that, along with the cooler conditions, played a part, I'm sure. So looking a bit further down the pack, and one of the big storylines heading into Suzuka was obviously that big switch after just 2 races. Lawson's back at Visa Cash App, and importantly, Yuki Tsunoda, in front of his home fans, gets to drive a Red Bull kitted out in Honda gear as well, for good measure. What a feel-good story that was. But how do you think that they both fared in their opening weekend for their new teams?
I don't think they were too different. I think Tsunoda is as good as what he is, but the Red Bull isn't quite set up to how he wants it to be. I think we can all agree on that. And as for Lawson, he outqualified him, but in the race, the tables turned and Tsunoda finished ahead of him. But it's not like it was a drastic difference. And I don't think we've seen too much of an improvement with either their drivers in the cars that they were in compared to what they were in China. But Tsunoda at least made up a few positions, but wasn't quite enough to finish in the points on that occasion. But there'll be more races where I think Tsunoda can actually become the Tsunoda that we all know and love. I think for Bahrain, on a track that he knows very, very well, we'll have to wait and see. But I still think there's going to be a big gap between Verstappen and Tsunoda, and that's something that Red Bull need to fix really in good time if they're going to be fighting for the championship with McLaren.
Yeah, I think it's very good data for them now. They've got 2 data points in Lawson giving his feedback and saying, look, I've driven this year's Cash App, and I've driven this is Red Bull, and this is my saying. If Tsunoda's feedback is exactly the same, then they can take that away and go, right, why is the Visa Cash App Racing Bull more drivable than our Red Bull? Why is it easier to put it in a window, a setup window, which the Red Bull seems to be very narrow on? And Max is just brilliant at being able to put it on that window. I admittedly jumped very early when I watched the results of qualifying Q1. They both get through, which, I mean, Lawson has been 20th on the grid for the last 2 races. He gets through into Q2, and Tsunoda had a good session as well. I jumped straight away, jumped onto Fred's and said, excellent. I think they've both proved their critics wrong, and this looks great. And then, of course, because I said that, so unfortunately it's my fault, Q2, they both get knocked out, 15th and 14th. So I'll take the brunt of this one. It was my fault, absolutely, for jumping the gun with that one. So as you say, I look forward to seeing how they do in the coming races. It will be very telling. As you say, Bahrain, they've all tested there, they know it very well. And as you say, Tsunoda was one of the few drivers to make up places. And the other one that I noticed jumped up a few places was Jack Doohan. Mentioned again his crashing FP2. Good recovery, I think, from a disappointing start to his weekend, having to give up his car in FP1 to Ryo Hirakawa. And yeah, he made up some positions. But did you see it that way, or did you judge him on that FP2 crash?
I mean, it's a weird one because he had his DRS open, Doohan, but did he try to turn it off and it wouldn't go off? Because we have seen that before. Do you remember Marcus Ericsson at Monza in 2018 where the rear wing was stock open as he slammed on the brakes for turn 1? That's what I was thinking. But the difference is that turn 1 is not a braking zone. You can easily ease off the throttle and get the car through there. Yeah, it was a very bizarre incident. I don't know what force of gravity it was in regards to the impact, but it was a very nasty shunt, and it left Alpine with a lot of work to do for the rest of the weekend. But I think the saving grace for them was that, given the stoppages we had, because Alonso went off, and then we had the grass on fire a couple of times in FP2, and we had a couple of stoppages in FP3 because the grass was on fire, and also in Q2, I believe, the grass was on fire again. So, yeah, that was a rather bizarre time. But for Doohan's weekend, I don't think it's been too bad, actually. He had a really disappointing showing in China where he got 4 penalty points, 1 for the collision with Bortoleto in the sprint and another for forcing Hadjar off the track at the same corner. At Suzuka, minus the shunt he had in FP2, I don't think it was a bad weekend. But when you look at the gaps between all of the cars, Perry, if Alpine had like the 5th or 6th fastest car, Doohan would be a lot higher up there. So I don't think we should judge him wholly on what we've seen from him so far this year, and maybe in Abu Dhabi, because he raced in Abu Dhabi for Alpine. I think there are going to be better races for Jack, but it's just depending on how long Alpine give him before they decide, should we put Colapinto in the seat.
Yeah, I've said on this podcast before, probably quite cruelly on Jack, it has to be said, that I almost believe that they jumped the gun. This is an Alpine team that have been stung by both Alonso and Piastri within the same week or fortnight. And so they were kind of stung by that, and they thought, right, we're not going to have that happen again. We are going to sign a second driver. We don't want it to be Ocon. Right, Jack, you're up, you're in. Then Colapinto was available, and they went, that contract, how watertight was it? Can we get out of it? And I feel, again, quite cruelly, that they're kind of going, well, what's the minimum amount of races we can do before we have to give a big payoff to Jack Doohan and say, thank you, we're going to swap you now. But we'll see if he has some big weekends, and he has some positive weekends. As you say correctly, he had a decent recovery this weekend after that crash. It was very strange, as you say. Was the DRS stuck open? They have to manually turn it off because they don't brake, for turn one. And there was an interesting theory that I'd seen, and Craig Slater questioned him about this after qualifying, was that in the simulator, apparently he could go through there with the DRS open, and that's why he tried it. I'm not sure whether to believe that, because why would you just go for it in practice, like one of the first times through that corner, without at least trying a lift off and then off the accelerator and seeing how it goes? So do you believe that theory?
It's hard to say. I mean, it's better for him to try it than maybe not, but at least it happened during practice and not in quali or in the race. And if there's a day to do it, Friday's probably the day to do it. You know, if they had like another chassis, which they had lined up in case Doohan had binned it, then okay. But if they knew that they didn't have another chassis available, then Jack wouldn't have gone for it anyway. So that's probably what made him think, do you know what, let's just give it a go and see what happens. And clearly it didn't work. So I think, go on.
I was going to say, I think it was Roman Grosjean that did the same thing at turn one in Silverstone. They let the DRS open through turn 1 and 2, and they wondered whether anyone would try it. And I think it was Roman Grosjean basically said, well, let's give it a go.
I think it was Marcus Ericsson that tried it, where I think he was stuck behind a car during the race. He had the DRS open for the first corner of Abbey, and it threw him off the road into the barrier and brought out the safety car. And that what prompted Formula One to not have that DRS zone again for the pit straight, because that's clearly not a braking zone for Abbey. But at least Jack recovered during qualifying, although he was only 19th in qualifying, with Lance Stroll being behind him. But he's made up a few positions in the race thanks to the strategy. So at least he's done well to get up that high. But Alpine do need to improve in the coming races if they're going to be fighting for top 10s regularly, because it's something they struggled in the majority of last year until they got it together towards the end. It feels like it's going to be repeated that this season.
Yeah, it was difficult when we were doing the pre-season and our predictions for where the teams might be. Alpine are one of the hardest teams, I think, to predict where they will be, because they finished so strongly last year, almost unexpectedly. They were sort of sliding, and then suddenly this jump back up the order. It was kind of difficult to go, okay, they're a manufacturer team, but they're a manufacturer team that are about to stop manufacturing their own engines and put a Mercedes in the back of it. So yeah, it's a bit awkward, but as I say, I hope to see them get more competitive and be in that midfield fight. Gasly seems to be trying to pull them up by the bootstraps to be in that fight, and it'll be good to see Jack Doohan. Again, I'll be honest, watching him in Abu Dhabi 2024 when he was given the chance there, he seemed a long way off in a car that wasn't as far off the pace as it has been. So I was a bit stunned, as I say, to see how far off he was, but he's been that bit closer. He is that bit more prepared now this season. And talking of other teams in that midfield fight, we've spoken a little bit about Racing Bulls, but Isaac Hadjar gave them their first points finally. We said that their strategies have let them down in the first 2 races, but finally able to get some good points and have a decent race. So points for Hadjar. It
was, and they got points in the sprint with Tsunoda as well, Perry. Let's not forget that. But they had they had a better weekend in Japan, did Racing Bulls, I thought, because they got the strategy wrong in China, where they gambled on both Hadjar and Tsunoda to do the 2-stop and hoping that the rivals of theirs would fall away on their second set of tyres, and they didn't. So, but this time around with Racing Bulls, with Hadjar, he had a brilliant qualifying despite the problem he had in Q1, which caused him so much discomfort, and the team had to swiftly turn it around for him, I think, before his final run in Q1 or in between Q1 and Q2. Otherwise, he wouldn't have come away with points. So that was a really important moment in the weekend for Racing Bulls to get the problem sorted out rather swiftly. And it paid off for him in the end. 7th in qualifying it was, and an 8th place finish. So I think Hadjar certainly had the best weekend of his career so far in Formula One. Are we going to see more of that in the coming races? I think we will. I think Hadjar is demonstrating what he can do. I think people were questioning on his temperament going into the campaign, because we saw in the junior series where he had this appetite to being hot-headed, especially over the radio with his crew. But it feels like he's fixed some of that since his signing for Racing Bulls. I think from the moment he knew he was going to be racing for them, he knew he couldn't be the same driver as what he was in Formula 2 and Formula 3 in terms of his attitude and his way of speaking to people over the radio. I think he needed to mild that down from the moment he stepped into the Racing Bulls seat. And I think he's demonstrated this year that he can mature himself and really take the fight to even be in the mix a little bit with the top runners. But I think he knows that he's not going to be in the fight with the top 4 teams. It's more about finishing 9th or 10th realistically, but 8th was very much on merit what he deserved.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? This is the team that ironed this out of Yuki Tsunoda. You remember his temperament was exactly the same, that fiery hothead. He'll get on the radio, and takes us nicely to Alex Albon, who did that this weekend. Bit out of character, it seems. This is someone that's been in F1 for a while, so maybe Hadjar, only his 3rd race, maybe he does come back at some point. But yeah, Albon didn't seem very happy. Maybe again, it's just what FOM decide to play out to us. But yeah, there was quite a few times where he seemed a bit hot under the collar.
I don't know if it was the pit strategy that he was upset about, or whether he was just, I don't know what pit stop lap he did. If I find it out very, very quickly on F1's website, I'll be able to tell you when they pitted. Because when he was speaking on the radio, did he say that he wasn't happy when in terms of the lap they chose to pit him in or something? I'm trying to remember.
I think he was also upset early on about gear shifts, wasn't he? I know Verstappen complained quite calmly about his gear shifts, but I think Alex Albon did the same thing. He said, this isn't shifting very well in a about way. And I feel like they asked him to change something on the steering wheel in the settings, and he basically came back and said, this is worse. I don't know why we've done this. This is worse than it was before. But it might have been the strategy. I'm sure later on as well, he came back to the strategy and said, why have we done this? All the meetings we had before.
Albon pitted 1 lap after Behrman. So
right.
that'll be maybe the reason why the team mentioned to him that Behrman had pitted the lap before him, and they wanted to cover Behrman off. So that may explain it. So, yeah, I mean, Albon, I know he felt frustrated, but I don't think he could have done more than what he did. And looking at the gap he also had when he finished behind Hadjar, the gap would have been just 3 seconds. Albon drove another brilliant race, and I think that's the first time in his career where he's scored points in the first 3 races of his F1 career, and also the first driver for Williams to score points in the first 3 races of the campaign since Felipe Massa and Valtteri Bottas in 2016.
Wow.
This
is a team that have won so many championships before, and all we can hope is that they're on the right trajectory under James Vowles to be back there, and all the signs look good at the moment, I think.
I agree more. I mean, it's a shame with Sainz, because I've been disappointed with Sainz over the course of the first 3 races this season, because you'd have thought that Sainz would at least be on terms with Albon, and it feels like that Albon has had the upper hand slightly so far. But we'll see how the next few races go. It could be that it's a bit of a it's maybe signs of rustiness from Sainz at the moment, because he's still getting to know the Williams machine as we speak. But I think time will come when Sainz actually does his A game from what we saw of him at Ferrari.
I think he's one of these drivers that every time he arrives at a team, he's underrated. They always, he's picked Williams. If you believe the rumors that he potentially had options elsewhere on the grid at, say, Red Bull and other teams that wanted him, it sounds like he picked Williams because of the rejuvenation project and believing in what they can do. It's almost the first time where he arrived at a team and you kind of expected him to be the lead driver. Now, that I don't think is any discredit to Alex Albon at all. I just think it's to Carlos Sainz's credit that he has arrived at these teams almost as like a second-rate choice and has proven what he can do at those teams. I don't think many people were saying about how many race wins he could get at Ferrari, but would he ever race? Would he ever get any race wins. And again, he went there and proved them very wrong, getting 3 wins, I believe it was, under Ferrari. So yeah, I'd agree with that. I think he has yet to really show what he can really do at Williams, and credit to Alex Albon, perhaps, that has been lacking in. He hasn't been tested, perhaps, and suddenly Carlos Sainz is there and he is bettering him. So yeah, there's a story there. I'm sure we'll see that develop over the course of the season. So the final real point about this race, as you mentioned earlier, there was the fires that were caused by the cars sparking. Obviously very dry Friday through Saturday, and I raised a question on Threads because I said I remember that they swapped these blocks. I think it was in 2017. I could be very wrong with that. I'm just pulling a year that sounds realistic in my head. They swapped these blocks, I believe, from magnesium to titanium, because titanium gives us lovely sparks, and the lovely sparks cause some fires. So what do we think of the solutions here? I posited that they could have almost like these cool weather, these hot weather kits, have like a thing that they say, it's so dry we need to use the different blocks, the B blocks, if they want to call them something like that. But they're probably not that easy to change. They're in several components. So what other potential solutions do you think there are to this problem? Because it's not the first time it's happened.
Well, we saw it in China last year, but it only happened on the one occasion. It's very rare we get these things, to be honest with you, Perry. So I wouldn't, if I was the FIA, I wouldn't panic too much over it, because we don't see this happening all the time. We're certainly not going to see it in Bahrain or Saudi or Miami. So I think it's one of those problems that will go away very, very quickly. It's not like they need to make swift changes to a particular machine just because of one incident, because it's very rare that we get incidents like that happening. It could be that maybe the ride height, there should be like a minimum ride height for these cars to tell the teams to maybe raise the planks a little bit, because the planks, without scraping along the ground, that's what's causing the sparks to happen, as well as the titanium and magnesium, whatever you call it, on the underside of the tray. I don't know. I wouldn't worry too much, because we are seeing sparks all the time anyway. We saw a lot of sparks even during the days of the turbocharged era in the 80s, where a lot of sparks were sort of flying off the rear of the machines, and it rarely caused any form of fire or any smoke on the grass. I'm a little bit surprised, actually, that given the cold temperatures over the weekend, especially overnight, that the grass wasn't more condensed. I thought there'd be a lot more condensation on the grass going into these sessions, and maybe that would have vaporized the grass a little bit so that it didn't catch fire or anything like that. I even saw some marshals actually on the screen had like watering cans out with them, just to go and water the grass a little bit, so that the sparks don't ignite it. But yeah,
I saw that.
Yeah,
and they're out cutting the grass, weren't they, Friday night?
Yeah, which they had to, I suppose. But other than that, that was probably one of the moments to take from the race weekend that, thankfully it was dealt with quickly by the marshals, because we don't want to see fire on the circuit anyway. It'd have been quite it'd have been quite something. But yeah, it's just one of those things to take.
Yeah, motorsport is dangerous enough. I think it was just the fact it was quite prevalent. FP1, FP2, FP3, and qualifying were all disrupted by fires. So I was sat there going, well, if I'm strategizing for this race tomorrow, I'm thinking, when's the red flag going to come out, and can I put a nice set of hard tires without ever having to stop? Because it almost seemed a certainty at that point that your race was going to be red flagged. So thankfully not. Thankfully it wasn't interrupted by them. And yes, yeah, a good point. Probably not going to see this again. Hopefully prop up soon. And yeah, they did very well to try all sorts of different measures to get it sorted. So to wrap up the Japanese Grand Prix weekend, Tom, I'm going to ask you 2 questions now. Driver of the day, I think you've all possibly already mentioned who you might go for with that, and highlight of the weekend as well for me, please.
So the driver of the weekend, I thought, was Max Verstappen. I thought the qualifying lap he did on the Saturday was what won the race, and I don't think Red Bull expected Max to come away with the win. They would have thought that McLaren were going to run away with it. And the highlight of the weekend, I think it's got to be the grass on fire, not just on one occasion, but on 5 occasions throughout the weekend. Thankfully, it didn't happen in the race, but hopefully we won't get any more of that in the near future.
Yeah, absolutely. driver of the day, I think easily. Driver of the weekend has to be Max Verstappen. Yeah, it was a perfect performance. I think that highlights what McLaren are up against. Something I spoke about at the end of our wrap up of 2024, that Red Bull and Max have this innate ability to perfect a weekend. They don't leave any crumbs on the table, and McLaren will be aware of that now, that they cannot even make micro mistakes over a weekend, because they are there. They will take them and they will hurt them. So big story for the rest of the year is how many mistakes can McLaren cut out of their weekends. They need to hit these perfect weekends. Highlight of the weekend. You would think, but asking this question and being host of the show, that I would think of this beforehand. I've only had 24 hours. For me, I think it was Jack Doohan's recovery, which I think is a bit strange. But I think that kind of accident, he didn't get FP1. He jumps in the car. The car's obliterated. It was a big crash that shook him up. I think recovering from that and turning that into a decent weekend, making places up in the race, I thought that was a highlight for me, that he really showed something there, that he wasn't scared of these big accidents, to have these accidents, and that he could recover well. So yeah, I'll give it to Jack, not driver of the weekend, but just for that highlight, just for that ability to recover, and to the media training, everything. He's getting difficult questions left, right and center, and he seems to be dealing with that at least as well. So wrap up there. That's the Japanese Grand Prix. And if anyone was thinking that this Formula One Grand Prix wasn't that interesting and you want to look at other motorsports, well, here is the itinerary for next week. As we say, we've got the Bahrain Grand Prix. Hopefully it's going to be a better race. We expect it to be a better race. We see Formula 2 and Formula 3 are joining as support races again. They're always good to watch. Formula E race at Miami this weekend. IndyCar at Long Beach. MotoGP are racing. World Superbikes, Supercars. There is Super GT. There's IMSA. There's GT World Challenge Europe all this weekend. So there's plenty of racing out there. What a bumper weekend. So yes, the next time you hear from us will be the Bahrain Grand Prix review. For now, Tom, thank you so much for joining me tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk about the Japanese Grand Prix with you. Where can we hear from you next?
Whenever I'm available. So I'm willing to be involved in the podcast again in the near future. But hopefully this weekend in Bahrain, we'll see more action. And of course, with all the motorsport series that are competing this weekend, it should be a fun, entertaining weekend of motor racing, that's for sure.
Excellent. And yeah, I was thinking you could plug your own podcast there if you wanted to. You're doing brilliantly. You're out there talking to some really top names at the moment. So you've already interviewed James Hinchcliffe and Alex Brundle, and there's someone else I've forgotten, but you're going to fill that in now.
Yeah, so it was Tom Gamer I got in for episode 2, but there is another episode coming out this week at the time of recording, and it's with Bob Constaduros, the champagne Bob guy, who I've got on for Wednesday. So do tune in for that, and I'll let you know when it does come out. It'll be announced on my socials very, very shortly.
And I'll post the link in our show notes here as well, as a thank you for coming on, being a brilliant guest. So I'm sure we'll have you back on very soon. But for now, thank you very much for listening at home. I've been Perry Brown. This has been the Motorsport Review, and I hope you have a very good week. Thank you. Bye-bye.